Hey folks, Daniel here, and today we are going to be replacing the seals and dust boots on our Brembo style calipers. Doing it here on the CTS V Sport. Same brake calipers on a lot of the Camaros or Corvettes. The ATS-V and CTS-Vs and higher level Camaros and Corvettes, they're gonna have the 6-piston calipers, but honestly, there's not much difference except more pistons to replace seals on. So this car has never had that done. We're gonna get that done today. I'm gonna also tell you why we're doing it and why you might need to do yours, so just keep watching. So we are changing these dust boots and seals because when I took apart my brakes recently, I found that my dust boots were pretty much completely melted. Now this is probably from tracking the car. I've tracked the CTS a couple times, done a lot of autocross, and it's not uncommon if you track your car that you're gonna heat up the brakes so much that those seals are gonna melt, especially when my last track day was over 100 degrees up at Thunder Hill. Now is this a problem? Well, honestly not a huge problem because there's plenty of race calipers out there that don't have dust boots around the pistons of the brakes. But those guys are maintaining the brakes a lot more than you are with your street car. And if you don't have dust boots, it's a great opportunity for dust and debris to get in between the caliper and the piston, down to the seals, damage the seals, then you have fluid leaks and then you have brake failure, and you don't want that. So for the CTS, for example, I've got a kit. It comes with the dust boots and the seals. We're just gonna do them all together. The car has about 83,000 miles on it. I think it's the right thing to do. And just so you know, the reason I got to finding this out is because I went to change out my pads. I had the Hawk HP Plus pads, one of the most aggressive street pads that's great on the track, and they worked great, but on the street, wow, they were dusty and really noisy, especially like at the slow speeds. So I just got sick of it. The car doesn't track anymore since I got the Porsche, so I got new pads. When I removed the old pads, not only are they really worn, I also found that the rotors were really worn, so much that some of the slots had actually started to disappear. And then that's when I noticed my dust boots were melted. So this video is all about the caliper piston seals and dust boots. If you want to know more about doing your brakes, you want to check out a couple videos that I'll have linked in the description below, and some actually might pop out right up here for you. All right, let's get started. I'll show you the parts and tools necessary to get this job done, and we'll knock it out. For this procedure, you'll need these supplies. You'll of course need the parts, the dust boots and seals. These come in packs of 4, one for each caliper. Get them from Rock Auto or your dealership. You'll need brake parts cleaner, at least 2 cans, some DOT for brake fluid if that's what your car takes, some new caliper bracket bolts, these are from O'Reilly, and lots of gloves and other cleaning supplies. As for the tools, you'll just need a lot of the standard brake stuff, plus a couple extras. We will definitely need a 21mm socket for the brake caliper bolts. You also want 10 and 11mm sockets for the banjo bolt and the bleeders, as well as a T30 Torx if you're gonna remove the rotor like I did for new rotors. A ratchet, torque wrench of course, some caliper hanging hooks, these are just made out of hanger, and some crush washers. This is a variety pack, it's always good to have, but I use the 3/8 inch ones out of this package. You want some brushes for cleaning, a pick or a small flathead screwdriver, a punch to get the pins out of the caliper, and a couple of clamps for this procedure. You also want standard brake grease and a small hammer to punch out the caliper pins. Once you remove the caliper, the brake lines are going to leak, and my little trick is to use these little vacuum caps. Go get an assortment from the auto parts store. These ones happen to be about 3/8 inches in diameter, and they fill the hole for the brake line while you work on the calipers. Check the description below for various links to these products. All right, I've already removed my brake caliper for this brake job, but now we need to disconnect it from the brake line. This is the banjo bolt. It's a 10mm on my car. You just want to unscrew that. I'm using a power tool to break it free. In fact, it may be easier to break it loose while it's still mounted to the car. Once it's off, you'll start leaking out, so just put that little vacuum cap in there and that seals that hole shut. You don't want to just leave it dripping. Eventually, you could be running out of brake fluid in your reservoir. Not a good thing. Here's the banjo bolt, close inspection. And here's the crush washer that fell off. You'll want to dump out whatever brake fluid you can from the caliper, otherwise it's going to make a mess. Honestly, it might make a mess later anyway, as you'll see. All right, find a good place to work. A lot of people just like to do it on the concrete with a piece of cardboard. I'm doing it on the workbench to film this. I've got a waterproof layer of paper and an absorbent rag. I'm gonna clean the caliper up real quick, not completely, just to get a lot of the free debris away from the pistons and seals. Now this is where the brake line was attached, and that's where brake fluid goes in, and it generally presses the pistons together to clamp your brakes. Well, today we're gonna use that same hole, but with air to push those pistons out. Now, if you don't have a big air compressor like this, don't worry, I'm gonna show you how you can do it still. Take the old brake pads or a block of wood and put them between the pistons because they're gonna go shooting out fast, especially with a strong air compressor. Now, instead of brake fluid, we're gonna shoot air in there, and oh my gosh, that made a way bigger mess than I expected, and got brake fluid everywhere. Make sure you clean that stuff up. It is pretty corrosive. But here are the pistons, just barely hanging on by the bits of dust boot that were left over. Take off all the leftover bits of dust boot from the pistons and set the pistons aside. Since some cars have different sized pistons in different positions, make sure you take note and don't lose track. The bases of the dust boot are probably still attached to the calipers, so make sure you pull those out as well. Now remember how I said you might not need a full-size air compressor? You could use a tire inflator and maybe even a bicycle pump, honestly. It only took about 20 or 30 PSI to pop these pistons out. Knocked them out in no time with my inflator. I wiped down most of the brake fluid and took a look inside. It's hard to see, but there are seals in there. They're marked here in red. We need to remove those piston seals, so I'm using a pick. You want to be careful with the pick because you don't want to scratch up the metal surfaces or damage the seal if you happen to be reusing it, but we're putting new ones in. I highly recommend using like a plastic pick or even a flathead screwdriver to do this. Once you get the seal popped loose a little bit, you can grab it and pull it out, or the whole thing might just pop out with one shot. Once you have those out, it's time to do some good cleaning. Use some rags and clean up the inside of the piston wells well, and spray it out with some compressed air to help dry it if you like. You don't want any water in there or anything. Now lube up the new seals with a little bit of fresh brake fluid. There is special brake piston seal lube, but I didn't have any, and it's pretty common to use brake fluid. Get the seals fully seated in there. You'll know when they're right because they're laying in there nice and smooth. It wasn't tough at all. Here on the left, the seal's installed and no seal on the right. Now we need to put the pistons back in with the new dust boots. Clean those pistons really well, and then we'll install the dust boots. The dust boot just goes around the ridge at the top of the piston. Work the boot around until you feel like it's really locked in. You can test it by pulling it down like this, like an accordion, and it shouldn't pop off. Before reinserting the piston, make sure it's really clean. You don't want any debris that would scratch up the seals. I'm also gonna lube up the piston with some fresh brake fluid and lube up the hole with some fresh brake fluid. Then take the piston, line it up carefully, make sure it's nice and flat, and press it down into place. It'll take a little bit of force to push it past the seal, but once it goes past, it slides right on in. Then press the rest of the dust boot into place in the caliper. All right, congrats, you've done one piston. Now let's do the next one. Remember, clean it up, put the dust boot on, make sure it holds on, lube up the piston, lube up the hole, line up the piston, and press it down into the hole. Then make sure the dust boot is fully seated. That's half the caliper, folks. Now we just need to do the other two pistons. Now you might be wondering, how are we gonna get the other two out without blowing out the new ones? Well, I'm gonna show you. This is where those clamps come in. I'm gonna use an old brake pad or a piece of wood, and I'm gonna clamp down the new pistons and seals so they have nowhere to go. Once those are held down, I can just compress air again and boom, pistons come out. Unfortunately, only one came out, so no problem. Let's take care of that one first. Same procedure. new dust boot, clean it up, lube it up, install the piston, install the rest of the seal. Great. Now we're going to repeat the clamping process, but this time we're going to add a second clamp and hold down our third piston. This allows the fourth piston to freely pop out. There we go. All right, same process, clean everything up, remove the seals, install the new seal and piston, and this caliper is done, folks. Repeat for the other side. I find it way easier to give the caliper a good scrub down before installing it, so I'm going to use a brush and some brake cleaner and even a little bit of all-purpose cleaner to get this caliper looking as good as I can. Now, remember the banjo bolt? There is a crush washer still on there. This one's coming off with pretty little effort, but it's because I've already installed it from the last job I did where I painted my brake calipers. I gotta tell you, the original crush washers that came on the car were a huge pain to remove. You can see me try to do this and get it done on my other video where I paint my brake calipers. Link in description below. So now I'm installing two new copper crush washers. One goes on the banjo bolt before it goes through the banjo nut, and the other washer goes on the opposite side of the nut against the caliper. Make sure you position the brake line the right way. The metal tube should be angling away from the caliper, and then screw on the banjo bolt and tighten it down real well. You want to make sure there are no leaks. Absolutely make sure. Since I had my rotor off, I'm going to install my new one and the new rotor retaining screw. Then I'll mount the caliper using new caliper bracket bolts. These are supposed to be replaced, but I have reused them a couple times in the past. Install the rest of your hardware as I've shown in other videos, and turn your steering and make sure that the brake line isn't under excessive tension or anything because you installed it incorrectly. All right, it's the next day. I had some things to do, so I'm gonna finish now by bleeding the brakes. It's a required step after replacing those seals in the calipers. Now, this job overall has been fairly easy, I think, as far as putting in new seals, but you have to have a pretty good set of experience, and that is pulling off the brakes and the calipers and having all the right tools, and you gotta know how to bleed the brakes. An absolute requirement since we just introduced a ton of air into the system. Now, I did have a video where I showed you how to bleed the brakes on the Cadillac CTS. When it comes to Brembo calipers with two bleed screws, you need to bleed the inner one first and then the outer one. But overall, I'm gonna do a full bleed starting with the passenger rear, the driver rear, the passenger front, and then the driver front. I used in that video the Harbor Freight bleeder. I'm not happy with that. You should use the Motive bleeder. That's what I'm going to use today. You can see that in action in my other video where I bleed the brakes on Vince's Miata, which is pretty much the same process except he didn't have two bleeder screws on his front calipers. So once this is done, I'm going to go bed the new brake pads, and then my car is going to be set for a little while, I think. Now, if you like this video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and of course hit the bell to be notified of other videos in the future. I am doing a brake bleed video on the Porsche GT4 as well. Thanks so much for watching the Jet Fueling channel. We'll see you next time.